Hello, everyone. Welcome back to a new episode of the Spiritual Inspired Show. I am your host, Claudio Murgan. For older episodes, please visit spiritualinspired.ca, gnostictv.com, and our YouTube channel. My guest today is Tom DiNardo. Tom, thank you for accepting my invitation.
Thank you for having me on your podcast, Claudio. I appreciate it.
Tom, you say that your first creator experience happened when you were 3, you were meditating by age 16, and had the first cosmic consciousness experience at 20. So let's take it one at a time, because at 3, not too many people are aware that they exist. How was for you?
Um, well, you hear in metaphysical and spiritual circles, people will talk about the youngest child is wiser than the wisest yogi, and others will say that when we're born, we possess a consciousness and an intelligence that's connected directly to the creator, and that as we age and as we mature, we unlearn, if you will, the knowledge, the secrets, the consciousness that we innately possessed as a child. And so, I do have brief remembrances of actually being born and coming through what seemed like a rainbow um, channel of light. I have very vivid memories, unlike a lot of people, of infancy and childhood. And at 3.5, my family had moved from Illinois to California. And it was a beautiful spring or summer day. And I was standing on the front porch. And what 3.5-year-old child starts thinking about the future and what they're going to do with their life? And so, of course, my incarnate experience was fairly limited. So I thought about it in terms of the comprehension that I understood, which was school and grades. So I started thinking ahead, counting on my fingers: kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third, fourth, fifth. I got up to sixth, and then I was getting a little cloudy. And I said, well, I think there's a middle school. Then I know there's a high school. And I wasn't aware that college was called college then. And then I said to myself, I think I go to work, get married, and have kids. And at that point, there was literally, it was a summer day. There wasn't a cloud in the sky. It was blue sky. And there was an ether that started to form around me. And a voice from within the ether, which I truly believe that these were angelics that had surrounded me. They said, Tom, you're here to do a lot more than to go to school, get married, and have kids. And then that ether kind of dissipated, and I hopped off the last step of the porch, and then I went out and played and did what a normal kid would do. But that memory had always stuck with me, that, the separation between us and the other world, the spirit world, the world of creator, is a gossamer thin veil. And so that was really one of my first experiences that began a lifetime of many experiences that dealt with consciousness.
You are a very versatile living man. At one point, you work as a park ranger and you had 2 near-death experiences. How those experiences change your life?
Well, at that point, again, I'd been very involved in the metaphysical community, which at that point was in the San Francisco Bay Area. So you couldn't walk 10 feet without bumping into a psychic or a healer or a tarot card reader or a massage therapist. And, it was a tight knit community. So all around the Bay Area, people knew who they were. And I remember the East West bookstore in Stanford, California was like this big hub for us to go and meet. And but at the same time, there was a lot of what I call charlatanism and people that were pretending to be what they weren't. And so I was in a career that when I went into it, it was for my love of the outdoors and the experience of being in nature and helping to educate people in nature. But at that point, there was also an incredibly big push for the law enforcement aspect, which I really hated or grew to hate. And so we were doing a drown training drill one day in which they submerged a dummy out in the middle of the lake. And it was early spring and it was fairly warm out, but the water was still very much in the high 40s, low 50s. And I was in my mid 20s in great shape, and all the other guys were carrying kind of a layer of fat like a walrus or something. And we all swam out to the lake. I was the first one out, waited for everyone to show up. We recovered the dummy, waited for everyone to come back in, and I was the last one in. And by the time I got to shore, I was feeling not so good, felt a little dizzy, and I kept feeling really, really bad. And eventually I sat down, and people were telling me, get a cup of coffee. And I started to feel this pain in my chest, and I was feeling nauseous, and I had no idea that I was going into cardiac arrest. And my body temperature had dropped to 75 degrees. So they threw me into the cab of the park ranger pickup truck, the vehicle. They blasted the heat, and I'm sitting next to a lifeguard supervisor. I was in the driver's seat, he's in the passenger seat. And a lifeguard had reached in and took the carotid pulse on my neck. And he said, oh my God, and at that point, as he's taking my pulse, I look at him and I can see his aura, and I can see the aura of the lifeguard supervisor, and I'm seeing the auras of everyone around me. And um, it was, I mean, I had seen auras before, but it's hard to explain. It's more the Ajna Center, but I was seeing it with my eyes and the Ajna Center, and it was very much like a psychedelic experience. Um, and he had taken my carotid pulse and he said, oh my God, I have no pulse. And at that point, it was as if I shot up through the top of my head, right through the cab of the pickup truck. The pickup truck had dissolved. And I was in a place that I can only call, I don't know if it was heaven or if it was kind of a greeting area. It was like a big, comfortable foyer of light where you don't think of yourself in the what I call lowercase r reality. You think of yourself in more of the capital R reality, which is just that the person that does not have, or the being that does not have personality, the I am of my soul. I knew I existed. I knew that I was alive. And I'm in this place of absolute unconditional love. And this being of effulgent light comes to me, and from the light occasionally I can make out a human form, and then it kind of turns back into this brilliant gold white light, and it's communicating to me, and it says, Tom, it's not your time. And I was pretty young and cocky then at 24, and I said, this is great. Why would I even think of going back into that confinement and that type of existence? I'm done. I've left. I've cashed in the chips. I'm here to stay. And the being kept saying, no, no, you have to go back. And one thing I've realized in my life since then is you can't argue with an archangel and win. And it was as if I was picked up in the hands of a parent, and swiftly, I mean, it was almost as if the speed of light being carried through this tunnel of existence. Wherever I was moving at great speed as if I was being held in the hands of a parent. And I looked up at this being that I later realized was Archangel Gabriel. And I said, I really don't want to go back. And with great humor, he says, I know, but you'll be back here before you know it. As if, what is a lifetime but a blinking of an eye to an angel? And so, next thing I know, it was as if, just like being born, I was on my back and I just went like I was, excuse me, taking a big breath of life. And I'm on a gurney, next to a fire truck, and there's all these firemen and policemen and park rangers around me and lifeguards. And I said to the supervisor, and everyone was freaked out because I was dead. And then I come back and their eyes are open, and the guy standing over me with the defibrillator. And I said, I don't need that. And so then they sent me to the hospital. My body temperature came up. I didn't even have to get admitted. I was already fine. And I said, I'm fine, I'm fine. And I got up. And then later in 1990, that was in 1990. And in 1993, I had another experience. I'd never done drugs, anything like that. I hit, again, what I call one of the many times that I'd hit rock bottom in my life. And I'd lost a job. I couldn't pay my rent. And um, I had to move back in with family. And it was just very humbling, very humiliating. And one particular night, I went to sleep and it was cold. I remember I just felt really, really cold where I was staying. And I had thrown the sheets, the blankets over me, and I was just shivering. And then there was this tremendous bright light that I could see piercing the blanket. And I thought I must have left the light on in the room. And I throw the blankets back. And this was literally like an experience out of Ezekiel, out of the Bible, because I didn't have a health event. I didn't have any drug event or anything of the sort. And it was as if this massive head ball of light had come up in the room, and it was as if the room had dissolved, like you see the walls around me, the corner of the ceiling, and this being just continued to come up, and it was almost this electric blue and brilliant white light with like two massive orbs. And the light was so bright and so intense. I closed my eyes and it was still burning my eyes. And I put my hands over my eyes and I could see the bones of my hands through my closed eyes. And I'm just on the bed, curled up in a ball. And I realized that was Gabriel. And I said, Gabriel, I know you're completely benevolent, but this is too much. This is too intense. I can't handle this. Would you please tone it down? And then he faded and went away. And then I had, I think, another experience after that, that same year, where all I can explain is I was lying in bed and I had awakened and my arms were outspread, my legs were crossed, almost like being on the cross. And I knew my eyes must have been open for some time because it was as if they were dry, like sandpaper, but I could not move. I could not move my hands. I could not move my body. And what I was seeing up through the ceiling was, again, like this circle of ether. And I was in this reality where you see a room with walls, but I was peering into another reality. And I remember when I was actually in that reality, it was literally what I would call heaven. I could hear the wind in my left ear and I could hear choirs of angels singing in my right ear. And then it was this feeling of being lifted back down through this reality back into the current reality. And then all of a sudden, it's like the ether starts to close and close. And all of a sudden, I'm back in my body and I start to convulse violently. But I still can't, I'm not in control of my body and I can't breathe and I can't scream. And I'm getting panicked because I can't do anything and I can't breathe. So the only thing I could think to do was to scream out in my mind, Gabriel. And by that point, the ether, the hole had literally become just a pinpoint. And then all of a sudden, it was as if it became wide enough, and this gold beam of light just came right down next to the bed. And this being stood over me with his hands over me and just held his hands over me. And my body started to calm down. And again, then it was the same thing. I just breathed in this breath of life. And then this beam just shot right back up through the hole back into the reality from which it came. And from that point, there were just a number of things that began to unfold. I started to, even after the first experience, I started to have great empathy. I thought I was dying because I'd walk into a room and I was feeling pain, just emotional, physical pain. And I started to realize I was picking up on everyone's stuff. And then eventually I played with that and said, well, I wonder if I can feel it. I wonder if I can help channel that through Creator to get it to go out of the body. And I started playing with that. And yes, that eventually happened. And then I started doing healing work and did a lot of work with people up and down the coast in Northern California, Southern California, and um, people that had cancer, AIDS, did a lot of work with the gay community and people that had Kaposi sarcoma and AIDS. And there were things that happened that to this day, I mean, again, it's Creator that does the work, and the human part of me still wrestles with and tries to comprehend. Like when a man comes to you who's covered in Kaposi sarcoma spots, and those all of a sudden get smaller, turn deep purple, turn magenta, turn pink, then light pink, and start to disappear. And, the man's in tears, and I'm just trying to stay focused and to be open, but at the same time saying, this is beyond my comprehension and beyond my understanding. Um, and that led to, seeing ghosts and doing some ghost busting. And then eventually um, started to have some experiences where I guess, as one of my mentors had said, when your energy gets bright enough and big enough, you start capturing the attention of those interdimensional beings and those extraterrestrial beings that start paying attention. And so then I started getting approached by people that, or beings that wanted to see how aware I was and sort of test me. And I remember a time where I was teaching a class on chakras and auras, or no, chakras. And I still have this bad habit from having been a park ranger and having had law enforcement training where I'm very hyper vigilant. I like to sit with my back to a wall. I'm aware of who comes and goes in a room. And I was in this store, and the owner said, well, take your time, you're on in 20 minutes. And I just walked down the aisle and I looked over my shoulder and looked back. And then from behind me, this little short man says, hello. And morphologically, his shoulders could not have been much wider than his head. And he was wearing this old Levi's shirt, the kind that the pinstripe shirt that the kid would have with the embroidered farmer. And you knew it was a kid's shirt, and his waist couldn't have been more than like 18, 19 inches. But he looked like a human, sand brown hair, blue eyes, glasses, little thin mustache. And he says, hello, Tom. And I look at this guy, and we've never met. And how do I know you? Well, you're teaching a class. And I said, right. He says, chakras. He says, well, tell me about chakras. I said, why don't you pay to take the class? And then he's continuing on. And he says, well, I have only four chakras. And I said, no, you don't. You have seven. And he says, well, you can see auras. And then I'm looking at him and I said, what did you say your name was? And he says, I didn't. I said, so what's your name? And he says, Traveler. And I said, right, because you're traveling. I said, where'd you say you're from? He says, I didn't. And intellectually, I mean, he's running circles around me. I can't keep up with him. And I'm trying to corner him in my questions, but I can't. And he's just smiling because he's enjoying my attempt. And then he says, look at my chakras. And I did. And sure enough, he had only four chakras. And now my eyes are wide and he's smiling. And he says, what colors are they? And I said, bright electric white, pearl gray, gray, and the very slightest hint violet. And I said, if I didn't know any better, I would think I'm speaking with someone who's not from here. He says, well, I told you I'm not from here. I said, right, right. And then at that point, the owner of the store comes right in front of us and says, um, Tom, you're on in 5 minutes. And well, before the guy says, well, I know you're busy. You have to go. And I said, it's been a really real pleasure. And we shook hands. I said, will we ever meet again? And he says, anything is possible. And then the owner of the store came in and said, you're on in 5. And I turned around and said, hey, I'd like to introduce you to someone. And I turn around. I mean, he's gone, literally like a Star Trek moment. I mean, and I said, hold on a sec to her. And I ran kind of around a couple aisles and he was nowhere to be found. And the funny thing is, several months ago, I was in a Best Buy computer store of all places, and I was in a real mood. I was pretty pissed off, and pretty angry, and I'm sure people could feel it. And this guy walks in front of me with a cane, and he's got a ponytail like I do, and you know, and he intentionally drops packages in front of me, and it was almost as if my humanity is always being tested. So I stopped and I picked up his packages. And he looks at me and I look at him and I hand him the packages and he says, thank you. And then I realized when I left the store, that's him. That was Traveler. But he was, again, kind of mirroring my appearance to a degree. And I went back into the store and he was nowhere to be found. And that kind of leads me to, I think, the time that we're in now, which is, needless to say, there's a lot going on in the world. There's a lot going on climatologically with the environment, food insecurity, enormous wealth being made, greed, people that are starving. We have more than enough resources to feed them, to give them potable drinking water, to give them health. And I believe that we are being watched, which is why angels are also called the Watchers. And I think that there are countless numbers of them that are on the planet right now, and they're keeping their hand on the pulse of humanity and testing us. And I feel that over the last couple of years, I'm aware, and I'm sure there's been more than that, but I'm aware of at least a half a dozen experiences that I've had that were not intended, but it was just being aware that someone was suffering. And, in the case, it was a homeless guy on a BMX bike, and he looked really thin. And I had taken some muffins from the hotel, which I'll often take food from a hotel when I check out just to give to people. And said, hey, brother, come here. And he comes over by my pickup truck and it's a green light. And I said, hey, man, go over there. I'll pull over. And he just looks at me beaming and says, we'll be just fine. And he's right in front of a semi truck that's coming and he's got his bike. He says, we'll be just fine. And I give him the chocolate muffins and I said, hey, brother, it's a green light and a semi truck's coming. Don't worry about it. We'll be fine. And then he's just beaming this light from his face. And then I realized, and I said, right. I said, well, it's green behind me. I have to go. He said, God bless you. And I said, I think he has. And I drove away. And the most recent experience was, again, I don't know, I think angels, I spent a number of nights through business, et cetera, at hotels. And so I was at another hotel. There was a guy in a parking lot, beat up SUV, and I offer him supplies. I'll usually keep blankets and clothes and things, and I offer him this bag of supplies, and he takes it. Well, the next day, I go out to my truck, and his vehicle's gone, and the bag is right next to my door, the door of my pickup truck. And as I'm walking to my pickup truck, which brings me to another point, everywhere I've lived, I've always had mourning doves congregate where I live. They just seem to come. And in Washington State, we get mourning doves, but in the southeast part of the state, not a lot in the northwest. But even here in the northwest, mourning doves, as opposed to the local rock doves, will come where I am. So I'm walking out to my truck at the hotel, and the bag's next to the door, and I see a mourning dove 10 feet from the truck, and he's just looking at me. And then he flies away. And I said, hello, Gabriel. Well, I see the bag of supplies. I'm thinking, dude, why'd you give me the supplies back? And there's a note on the footrail of my truck, and there's a rock. And the note says, have you seen him lately? And when he said him, there was a drawing under it, and it was a circle with a triangle and an eye in it, like the eye of God, which when I meditate, I see the eye of God every day. And I'm thinking, okay, because I had a vibe when I met him the night before, because he was over 7 feet and real thin. I said, you're not quite right. There's a little more going on. And then literally the last time I stay at the hotel, I happened to park, and next to me is the same SUV. And I thought, okay, I'm asking you this time and I'm going to get an answer, but he was not in the SUV. And the same thing, I leave the next morning, got up real early, and his SUV was gone. But it was this sense that I'm being watched. And now more than ever, in these times where it's hard not to have a certain amount of fear because these are human emotions, I feel that I am being watched over. I feel that I am being protected. And without being cavalier, I'm also becoming more outspoken about things that I believe are necessary to talk about during these times, because if we don't bring enough awareness and attention to them, then we are not remedying a problem as much as we are becoming a part of the problem.
Yes, some beautiful experiences. Thank you for sharing. And yes, I think more and more people are called to come public with what they are capable of doing by helping humanity. And I want to go back for a second to what you said, that there are watchers or angels overseeing what we are doing. In your opinion, and based on your interaction with them, do you think that they will prevent a nuclear war or anything at that level of destruction on Earth?
Well, Claudio, as they say, God gives us free will. Do I believe that we, in our hubris and our arrogance, will be allowed to destroy that which God created? No, I don't. I really don't believe it. I think there's not only God that to contend with, if you will, and his army of angels, but I do believe that there are interdimensional beings and extraterrestrial beings that have also had a hand in our development, if you will, if not through direct DNA manipulation, also spiritually and bringing us up. And I don't believe that that would be allowed to happen. And I think there's already been enough videos that are out there on YouTube and other sources where, like Elon Musk sending up a test rocket, and there's this ball of light hovering around it, shooting lasers and disabling it, and then the rocket goes off course and blows up. I think that I don't think that that's going to happen. What I do feel, and I was public several months ago before August, that I felt that August 28th would be a wake up call. And we had the things going on with Gaza, Ukraine that day. It was a particularly newsworthy day. And I had another vision that said something in October, this month that we're in right now, October 18th. It's going to be a wake up call, a revelation, if you will. And it comes down to two choices: creator or the things of man, materialism, greed, the AI, the digital age. A lot of people talk very highly about AI, and I don't see it as being something that's going to be like Terminator or Cyberdyne, but I also see it as being something that could ultimately change the course of humanity. And this reminds me very much of the Hopi Indian belief which is now something, and I'll digress for a moment. Part of my background was I grew up very much thinking that I was a white kid, two very patriarchal families, Sicilian and Irish, but my Irish grandfather in 1927 had married an indigenous woman. And so that she completely assimilated, which a lot of friends of mine who are native have said it's very common. And then it happened a lot, at the turn of the century. And that, if a woman could assimilate and marry into a family, she did, and she often gave up her identity altogether. So that was something that's always been a source of transgenerational PTSD, if you will, and shame. And it's been something that I finally, over the last couple of years, have really learned to embrace, because there were things that I thought I knew spiritually, metaphysically, that now, embracing my indigenous culture, when you look at things from that perspective, there are so many things that in the Western world we think we know that we really, really don't. And so back to this belief and this story about like the Hopi prophecy, they foretold several hundred years ago the end of America as we know it. And using your example, do I think it's going to be a big nuclear crater? No. Do I think it could be the end of the government? Yes. Do I think that there will be a lot of suffering and a lot of loss of life? Yes. Um, but I look at it as this wonderful story that was told by Floyd Red Crow Westerman, who was Hopi, talking about the Hopi Indian prophecy. He said, those who basically live the Indian way are going to be okay. Those who don't, well, they're not going to be around. So the way I summarize that all in a nutshell is, when you live in balance, as Native American people did, as many of us are trying to do today, not just Native American, but those of us who are conscious, living spiritual lives, we understand the balance that you don't need the massive, huge house. You don't need to drive a Bentley. $1 million is not that much different than $10 million or 100 million or a billion. You can only hold, it's like people who, I was driving through Idaho, I'm segueing here a couple of weeks back, and there was this sign that said, in Bonners Ferry, you're entering Trump country, where God loves Trump, guns, ammo, and family. And I was thinking to myself, I didn't know that those were God's priorities, guns, ammo, and I thought, really? And it made me think that, back to balance, that if we're living in balance, we will be guided, we will be directed to where we need to be to do what we need to do. And those who aren't, well, they may be in a skyscraper somewhere in New York City, and something happens and the skyscraper comes down, or an earthquake. And we're seeing this all around the world now. Like, in Afghanistan, they had the big earthquake. Sudan, there was a landslide. I mean, things are happening. Could you call it karma? Well, I think even the climate change, there's planes getting batted around in this country. The storms are becoming more powerful. I feel that those who are trying to force nature to do what they want nature to do, and those who are trying to force a result and living in man-made, imbalanced environments, are going to, in essence, suffer the consequences of those choices they make. Whereas those who are living in harmony with nature, living in harmony with creator and with spirit, will be safe. And I really do feel and believe with all my heart that there is great times of change that are happening. And I try not to be pessimistic. I try to frame it in a positive light, but I can look at it as, will people perhaps perish and die? Yes. But I can also look at it as another theory that's emerging right now, that's this idea that our third, fourth, and fifth dimensional bodies are coming together in union, and that we have 12 dimensions to our body, and the 12th down can see everything that the other dimensions below it are doing, and we on the third can maybe see glimmerances of what happens in the fourth or the fifth. But this idea that these bodies are coming together, that it's not going to be everyone at once. It's not going to be a snap of the fingers and then all of a sudden everyone on planet Earth is a bodhisattva. But I think it's going to happen in waves, and that these individuals will have gifts to bring to the world and insights. And the way that I can also think of it is this whole idea and this concept that now the Yahoo computer's proven that there are multiverses and multiverses. So I use the analogy that sort of, you're in a room with 100 people, you blink your eyes, 50 people are gone. Those 50 people blink their eyes. They're still both in the same room, the same city, the same state, the same country, the same planet, but perhaps in a different universe. And maybe it's the division of consciousness that starts to pull us apart. So maybe there's a world in which, Trump is the supreme leader, where God loves Trump, guns, ammo, and, family. And then I would probably choose not to be in that world and be in the other one where I'm living in harmony and not feeling that. And I think consciousness, or that old phrase, water finds its own level, I think it's absolutely true. You know, um, Again, when we're in harmony, we find ourselves experiencing an energy, a balance, a connection to Creator that also makes me segue. I just had a conversation. I was on a Zoom meeting yesterday with a woman who was curious. She asked me about Heyoka. And I explained to her that when I had written this article, she asked, "Are you Heyoka?" And I said, well, let me qualify this, because now we're talking a little bit about cultural here. And depending upon what native culture you are, there's a lot of definitions. And I said, normally the first is the calling, where you're struck by lightning. I said, for me, it actually happened in 94 when I was in Fort Berthold, North Dakota. Some people, it's metaphoric, where they're struck by lightning. Now, in the Lakota way, they go a step further, where they talk about puppy medicine, where you dispatch a puppy and there's a ceremony, you make a soup, you consume the soup. I haven't done that. In the Lakota way, I'm still what's called a thunder dreamer. But my point is that when I was talking with her about what is Heyoka, I said it's an empath, it's a healer. We know far more today about, Buddhist monks and Hindu yogis than we do about the Heyoka. And I said, the Heyoka, I said, when you think of like these old stories, the Hobbit, and witchcraft, these are people who use acts of will to force things to happen. And it's sort of like, again, the man-made example in the divergence of the world. You try to build a multi-million-dollar home on the coast in Southern California, where really there shouldn't be homes because there's landslides, and you keep shoring it and shoring it up. You're forcing something that nature doesn't want to do. And who do you think is going to win that battle eventually? Nature. You try to build these million-dollar homes in areas that are prone to forest fires. What do you think is going to happen eventually to that home? It's going to go up in smoke. When Heyoka is historically been known as a healer, a seer, they're often called sacred clowns, weather doctors. When people ask, well, what is Heyoka? Where does that energy, that ability come from? I said, you're not forcing anything. What it is you're in complete alignment with Creator. So you're not forcing an act to happen. If it's a healing, if it's changing the weather, you're in perfect alignment with Creator at that point, so that whatever happens, the result that happens is because it's meant to be that way and it benefits the people. But Heyoka also has a gift that, unlike Buddhist monks, I mean, sometimes they talk about this in Buddhism in the Zen koans where a comment will be very abrupt. Heyoka is always at the right time, the right place, saying the right thing that needs to be said. The question is whether or not the people that are hearing that message are receptive to it. Some are, and some approach it with great disdain, but it is the right message at the right time. And that's something that also is part of my life right now. I'm understanding that very clearly, that I choose when to speak, how to speak. And, truthfully, I've actually been very withdrawn the last couple of 3 years. You're the first person that I've agreed to do a podcast with in 3 years because it felt right. And I'm also very clear that this is not about me. This is about Creator through me. This has nothing whatsoever to do with me. The gifts that I have are given to me from Creator for the benefit of the people that ask for the help. Um, when I see something, a vision, or have a prophetic dream, I don't always share it with everyone. I share it with a few. But I understand now also that, like your invitation, I believe that water finds its own level and that the people that I'm supposed to be in community with, they, we are coming together because it's necessary and it's required. Um, so I'm not trying to force a movement or anything to happen. That's called a cult. And I have no interest in that. What I say to people is don't recognize the man, recognize the actions that he does. Yeah.
Mm. Tom, amazing knowledge. Thank you very much for sharing. And I wanted to bring in our discussion your indigenous heritage, and thank you for bringing it up. And I know I mean, I'm fascinated by the indigenous knowledge, their way of living. I read as much as possible. I even had a session with one um, elder from Africa. He transitioned 2 years ago, but we had an amazing experience. I read his book. So I also know that it's not easy for a half white in your case, and I hope I'm not
No,
uh,
not at all.
making any judgment
we
here.
we call ourselves half breeds. Yeah.
um, to
It's
go
a term
back.
of endearment.
Yes. So it is hard for you to find your way back, because I heard from other communities, even the both parents were indigenous, but belonging to different bands. It was hard for them to adapt to one lifestyle. So how easy or hard was for you to go back and even convince White Eagle, the medicine man, to mentor you?
Well, I have a number of mentors, a number of brothers and friends from various tribes across the country. What I find is within indigenous culture, there there's a number of movements. There's a strong division even within indigenous culture. You'll have some people that will call themselves full bloods, and the term full blood is really misleading because almost every Native American that I know has some European ancestry, even the darkest complected Native Americans that I know. And there are Native Americans that I know that are blonde hair, blue eyed, and fully enrolled in tribes, and 100% enrolled Indians. Um, but obviously, there's this movement where many natives are very cruel to people that they perceive to be less than. So they'll call us colonizers, or you're the white colonizers, or they'll say you're not Indian because you don't fit their paradigm. And on the flip side, there's another movement called Not Native Enough, where we're on the outside of the circle because we don't fit the paradigm. And in my case, for example, I can prove my family lineage. I mean, I'm not enrolled with any particular tribe, but I can prove my family lineage going all the way back to 1861. Um, and it's undisputed and it's historically proven. Um, Now, if someone wants to accept me, which I have brothers and family that do, great. If people don't, well, that's great, because I'm also at a stage in my life where I'm starting to fully understand there's going to be people out there that love me for reasons maybe known to them, and there's going to be people out there who hate me, because I'm a free speech leftist liberal, or people are going to, on the flip side, love me because of the things that I do, and there'll be people that hate me because of the things that I do or my beliefs, because I don't agree with, and I'm not here to agree with anyone. I'm also not here to change anyone's mind or opinion. Um, I have information. I'm happy to share what I know. If it benefits you, great. If it doesn't benefit you, great. But I'm not here to sell anything. And I know on LinkedIn, which is the only social media that I do, I've had people say, go on TikTok, go do this, go do that. I'm not feeling compelled to do that, because then to me, that dilutes my message. And that, to me, people want, and that's again, this whole world of creator or the digital age, greed, money. When you're doing something because it's all about likes and it's all about followers and it's all about this, well, how real is that? I mean, I see people on LinkedIn, they put up a post, which is some meme that you can download off Google Images, and they get 100 likes. And I'm thinking to myself, well, isn't that fucking original? And then what I gravitate towards is someone who has an original thought. Say something that I haven't heard or seen before, provoke my thought, provoke my response. Let me take this in. Has this changed my perspective? If you're someone like that, I'm interested in you. And I don't care if you have one connection or one follower or none at all, because you caught my attention. But I know there's other people out there who view it totally differently. Um, so, where I'm also proud of the fact that I do have Italian heritage and I have Irish heritage, and I'm very proud of my family and my Irish family and Sicilian family. But today I'm living a life as a spiritual man, and my spirituality is definitely reflective of the Red Road, with aspects, I would say, of Buddhism and Hinduism and Christianity. But I know that most Christians would not accept my beliefs and opinions about Christianity because they are very different. I don't believe that the Messiah is God. I believe he was a messenger. I believe in the Christ consciousness, which is that consciousness that that humanity can embrace, and that when you're within that consciousness, that's where miracles happen, like Heyoka. Um, and so I know that often will come on fire, and I've had some strong conversations with people, but today I'm more of the mind would say, believe what you want to believe. That's great. More power to you. And I gotta go, because I'm not here to convert anyone. And I think the big joke of it all is, I think that when Jesus walked the planet, I don't think he was trying to start a religion. I really
No,
don't believe that, you know.
yeah, I agree with you. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he was a Jewish carpenter who was a member of a really mystical order called the Essenes, and it's like far out. And he had a good, and he enjoyed his glass of wine. It's like, dude, I can relate, and I would have loved to break bread with you. Just my thought.
Yeah. So being on this path and following the traditional way of living, do you drum? Do you play the flute? Do you do a little bit of peyote or any other sacred plant medicine?
Um, I sing. I don't play the flute. I do play a little guitar, but not in ceremony. I'm learning to drum, but that's a restricted position. Um, as far as peyote ceremony and psychedelics, as we discussed earlier, um, my views today are very much like that of one of my mentors and one of my greatest teachers, who is Ram Dass, or Dr. Richard K. Alpert. God rest his soul. One of the most pure teachers that I had ever met. And I've met a lot of spiritual teachers from around the world, J. Donald Waters or Kriyananda, Louise Hay, many, many, many people. But the one who most impressed me was Ram Dass. And he had probably done every drug known to man countless times, and discusses of a time in his life where he was, as he put it, in this high for almost 8 years straight. And it wasn't until he had gone to India and met his teacher, um, named Karoli Baba, or um, Babaji, and that when he had his enlightenment experience, that's when things changed. Um, I would say a few years ago, I had an enlightenment experience. If you ask me, do you feel you're enlightened? Nope. Mm-mm. Are there steps along the way? Mm-hmm. Sure. Do I know it all? Not at all. Do I think I'm perfect? Not at all. I screw up every single day. And I'm happy to admit that, because I'm a human being. I have strong feelings. I feel love. I feel anger. Um, I feel passion. I'm a man who has every inconsistency and every issue that most of us do in day-to-day living. Do I hold any delusion that I'm perfect? Not at all. I'm really trying to keep myself grounded. And when it comes to the psychedelics, um, people were under the impression that I was a guide, and I have guided people. I do have a lot of knowledge. I've studied mycology for 20 years. Um, but I never used psychedelics until 2021. And I have an attitude about them which is far different than a lot of people. And this is where I say my opinions are strictly my own. You either can agree or disagree, but my opinions are my own and I own them completely. Um, I believe, as Ram Dass did, that it's consciousness that ultimately changes us. And when we change, the greatest gift that we have to give to the world is that of our own personal transformation. And that when our consciousness changes, our world changes around us. And I believe that psychedelics are and can be a very strong medicine, and they are a sacrament. Now, there are people out there that like psychotropic medications in the United States. There's 110 million Americans on psychotropic medications. And my question is, why? Because if you're 1/3 of the country and you're taking psychotropic medications every single day, every week, every month, every year for years on end, you're not doing the inner work. Is that a judgment on my part? No, it's not a judgment. It's an observation based on fact. Now, if you're doing the inner work, well, then you're making a change. And if you make a change, then you may not need the medicine. But there are people that are simply taking psychotropic medications, throwing them out the window and saying, well, now I'm microdosing mushrooms every day. Well, how's that any different? And what are you doing for the work inside? Are you praying? Are you meditating? Are you eating right? Are you exercising? Are you giving that time to Creator who created you, and acknowledging and giving gratitude and expressing thanks? So when you do the inner work, And I feel, and you set yourself up in a position that you are prepared to then take the medication or the medicine, whether it's psilocybin or what have you. As we had discussed earlier, it's almost like the awareness and the messages that can come forward can be literally almost like the equivalent of having gone to a therapist for 20 years, cognitive therapy, or or even someone who practices EMDR, and you could have a breakthrough that could catapult you literally 20 years ahead in terms of consciousness. When it comes to peyote ceremony, I'm a lot more guarded because I'm not a holy man. I don't hold the title. I'm not a road man. I have knowledge about the ceremonies, but I have great respect for my family and my brothers who do it. So when I speak of peyote, I'm going to speak in the most general of terms, that it's a paste that's created from the peyote button, which is a cactus which has mescaline. And you also will take tea, and there can be 4 rounds, of the medicine during a ceremony, which lasts all night. But I want to be emphatically clear. The bulk of the ceremony is prayer and songs and drumming. And there have been plenty of studies in psychology that, like, there's even tribes in Africa that have what are called trance dance, where all they do is drum, and they can get into a transcendental state without the aid of any medications or sacraments or psychedelics. Every Native American roadman I know and holy man agrees with that perspective, that the medicine, that it is not about, it's a sacrilege, it's a denigration of the ceremony for people to think of it as being a journey or to go into it with expectation. The idea is that you're preparing yourself mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually, so that you're in the frame of mind that when you are engaging in the prayers, the songs, and hearing the drumming, and then you take the medicine, which the Native Americans regard as a sacrament. It is just as if we were going to Catholic Mass and having the Eucharist. It is that same concept, that then you're in the greater reality, again, that capital R reality, and that the messages that come can be deeply personal, and they can be very transformative to the degree that you allow them to be transformative. Um, I think that people who would seek going to a holy man or a medicine man, and there's a couple I know that have sold out, and they're the term for that in the Native community, you would call them an Uncle Tomahawk, that when they're selling an experience or a journey, they're really degrading what the ceremony is about. It's an honor to be in that ceremony. It's something that if people sought it out, a self-respecting medicine man or roadman would turn the people away. If someone's just looking for the high, you can get mescaline on your own and do your own thing. But to me, it's the same thing. It's no different whether someone's taking psilocybin, LSD, ibogaine, ketamine. How are you taking it? And what's the intention of taking it? And unfortunately, it is my belief, in my opinion, that the vast majority of people that are taking it recreationally, which I personally think is a disservice to themselves, and it's a disservice to a greater community. And unfortunately, I think this whole psychedelic renaissance that started to emerge in 2021 and 2022 was really tainted. And if you really look at it, at one point I had the largest psychedelic group on LinkedIn, and it grew so fast, so exponentially. And then after 4 months, I hit the delete group button and blew it up, because I was hearing things and being exposed to things that all went back to, again, that fork in the road. Are you with creator, or are you with money and materialism? And when you start to hear and see attorneys, medical doctors, therapists that are basically pushing their wares, well, the Beatles had a song about that called Dr. Robert. You need to feel good, go see Dr. Robert. He'll give you what you need, or the Rolling Stones running for the shelter of Mother's Little Helper. Well, you're not dealing with the issue. And the psychedelic renaissance really became no different than everyone was comparing it to the Summer of Love, in 1967, except that behind it was money. And then when you start to look at things like ketamine clinics, and ultimately these organizations that were opening 100 or so ketamine clinics at once all around the country, well, who's funding that? Well, was it the mafia? Maybe not, not at all. I mean, there's or a lot of money that can fund things and channel things to get drugs in the hands of people. And then you start to see these states become involved. And many of the states that started to legalize some of these, like psilocybin and ketamine, are now turning away from it. And it became a big joke, especially like here in the Northwest. Oregon had this whole thing about setting up this therapist license, which ultimately, if someone would have gone through the whole training, was something like the equivalent of $20,000, ultimately not even being able to legally deliver the psychedelic to the person that needs it, which means then that the state's taking the money in hand over fist, but who's really doing the service? It's the clinic under a medical doctor that's charging someone $15,000 to $20,000 to basically get the equivalent of 2 doses of psilocybin. Well, what does this really tell you? Well, now we're back to the gray market and the black market. Well, someone can just buy their own mushrooms or do whatever. But again, let me be emphatically clear. My position is I don't do psychedelics for the sake of psychedelics. I'm involved in ceremony. Am I involved in ceremony weekly, monthly? No. I'm only involved in ceremony when I feel called to it and I'm in a good place, in my mind, my heart, my soul, where I'm ready to make that change in myself. So that's what I believe. And I also believe that Ram Dass firmly believed in that after he had his experience. It ultimately, everything that we do, it comes down to us. It comes down to our choices, the choices that we make, and how we impact and affect other people. Um, Going back to that same conclusion that we are humans, we are imperfect, we will never be perfect, we will always screw up, we will always make mistakes. But the idea is start to give yourself a break, forgive yourself, love yourself, try to love other people. But if you can't love other people, as I've said publicly, be present. If you can't love them, like the good folks up in northern Idaho who believe that God carries a gun with a lot of ammo, uh, well, maybe I can't quite gravitate towards the love of that belief or those people, but I can try to be present with it and try to gain an understanding of where they're coming from. Um, and within the context of their belief system, where are the parallels that we do share aside from those that we don't? How do we connect if we need to, as we need to? Um, and I think that that's where we're back to this time that we live in about the month of October. I think that there's going to be a great deal that goes on nationally here in the United States, I think in Canada as well. Internationally, we know the 3 big governments that are pushing an agenda. Um, we know that that agenda is motivated by nothing less than money and greed and power. It's self-serving. It doesn't benefit people or humanity. And I also believe that we are going to see tremendous changes on the planet, climatologically, as well as um, geologically, tectonically, with quakes, with shifts. Um, and I'm also fascinated by the fact that many world governments are starting to recognition that we are not alone. And like the asteroid Oumuamua that came to Hawaii in 2017, now we have A3 or AI Atlas that they've said is sped up, slowed down, it's getting bigger, it's getting smaller, it's changing trajectory. Well, that's not the behavior of a normal asteroid. And folks, let's just be honest here. We aren't alone. And I know that that kind of challenges a lot in the Christian paradigm, but the other thing that caught my attention was about 4 weeks ago, there was a news line. It was only online for about 72 hours that talked about a Jupiter sized rogue planet that had entered our solar system. And they're talking solar system like by the Kuiper Belt. And this was on MSN. This was on some very highly regarded scientific websites. And within 36 hours, gone. What are we trying to hide? Well, again, maybe we're not really alone. And I embrace that. And I personally think it's time for us to start to expand our consciousness and our belief systems beyond the confines of our personality and our limited awareness to try to expand, to understand other people, to embrace new thoughts, to embrace different religions and different belief systems. And again, we come to that fork in the road. And I know that not everybody is going to jump onto one ship or the other, but I believe that those who live in balance are going to be led and guided to do and be where they need to be at the times that they need to be there, much like Heyoka.
Yeah. And Tom, I agree that we live in a very interesting virtual reality. Every day is different and is very challenging. And I want to go back for a second to the sacredness of the indigenous ceremony and to the drumming. I interviewed two students of Joseph Rael, beautiful painted arrow, both of, white nation, if I can say that, a lady from Italy and a psychologist from the US, and they wrote 4 books together. And they both talk so nicely about his teachings and the ceremonies they're invited to participate in, the dancing they had in the desert, the spirits they encounter. And again, the experiences what were out of this world, and they were marked for life by that interaction with Joseph. And I assume that any ceremony, as you mentioned, we have to approach with sacredness and respect. And yes, the drumming can be that psychedelic factor in a ceremony and for someone who wants to expand his or her consciousness. And I, several years ago, I took a shamanic course with now late Hank Wesselman, and it was unbelievable. Every session had a journey, 15, 20 minutes journey through drumming. And it was beautiful. We didn't require any substance in order to journey and go into our sacred garden.
It's That's the beautiful thing about consciousness. And as your consciousness expands, obviously the old phrase, that where one or more gather in the name of God, God is present, just like if you're in an ashram praying or meditating, the vibration raises. So when you're with like-minded people, your vibration is going to raise, your consciousness is going to raise, and you will experience things that you don't normally experience. Just as conversely, if say you go into a bar, there's the lowest common denominator energy. Or let's just say if you go into Walmart, well, now you're at the lowest common denominator, energy. And that happens in public places, airports, etc. What I've kind of going back to a point that I mentioned earlier, there is so much that we believe we understand in Western culture. And then when you look at it through a different lens or a different experience through indigenous culture around the world, there's things that we just can't explain. And I'm really things that even, and I would say my belief was a lot more expansive than most people in this country, but there are things that I understand now that happen in other planes of existence and dimensions that impact us here, just as what we do here impacts them. And um, when Native Americans talk about spirits, whether you want to call it the little people, the elementals, um, it exists. They exist. And we, I personally will say that I've seen this only a few times in my life where someone can, quote, open a portal to the spirit world. I mean, we can cross through that portal into the spirit world. I had a phenomenal meditation last night where I felt there was an opening between the angelic realm and where I was. But I have seen in ceremonial experiences portals open into other worlds where we can cross over there and they can come here. Um, I also believe that with healing, and this is really what I'm about in my journey these days, which is um, it goes to a whole different level, which is the level of consciousness. And that when we look beyond the appearance of what for people may seem to be imperfection or a state of imbalance, and we start to understand that there is only the perfection of the creator within that individual, then that cannot help but change within that individual. And to that end, when we say look at it through the lens of Christianity, you know, as Jesus said, as I do, all of you can do and greater if you have the belief and the faith in God. And when you start to understand the power of realization and that it's really looking beyond appearance to knowing the truth, the absolute immaculate truth of an individual, you don't have to do hands-on. You don't have to, you get to a point where you're not only not doing hands-on, you can sit across from someone, you can be in another room, you can be in another city, another state, another country, and yes, even another planet. And you can reach out and touch a being, and they can reach out and touch you. And this is where I feel that this consciousness is what has us as a civilization and humanity on the verge of our evolution to becoming perhaps a different species that is more consciousness focused and where our potential expands. I know that there is far more possible now within my being and through the gifts that Creator has blessed me with. And I know that this is also happening with many of you out there, with you and with thousands of other people at this time on this planet to bring about a change. Because as the consciousness shifts, as more people transition and we transform ourselves, this world will transform. And I don't know ultimately what the end picture looks like. I've asked, I have a glimmerance of what's coming. But all I know is it does come down to ultimately a choice. And I believe that that choice is coming very soon, if not this month, which I believe is that it's going to come down to the choice of what we do and how we live, um, and how we treat each other. Uh, and there's so many of us that are so blind to the suffering of our fellow humans. And by the same token, I understand that we can't save everybody. We can't heal everybody. And in that last breath, I also understand that we have to make ourselves a priority. We have to heal ourselves and care for ourselves before we can care for another. And that doesn't mean being selfish about how we do it, but it means making ourselves a priority when we need to, and then being able to share from our blessings. And Creator has a funny way of blessing us, because it seems as if the more we give, the more we receive. And it's a divine cycle that keeps going. And it's also conversely interesting how, when people try to take from another person, how they get things taken from them. Or when someone tries to intentionally hurt another person or another group, how that harm comes back and befalls them. Um, I don't know where I was there for a minute.
No, it's fine. And to be honest with
Yeah,
you, I always mention when I interact with someone who needs some guidance, I tell them, you are the most important
yeah,
person in the world. Take care of yourself first and
yeah.
then care about anyone else. And early in the discussion, you mentioned Kriyananda's name. And this funny thing, he was born in Romania, where I'm originally from. I wrote his book. I read his book and then got into Yogananda's realm and teachings. So, how did
Mm.
you find interacting with Kriyananda?
Truthfully,
Yes.
uh, well, I was very impressed with Paramhansa Yogananda and his teachings, and of course, never met him. He was gone before my time. Um, but he struck me as being someone who was very much real, like Ram Dass. And when I met J. Donald Waters, it was in 1990. And to be completely honest, the experience that I had with him, I was exhausted. I'd been up for like 2 days. I was traveling or something. And I met him, and he did something with chi, but it really struck me as, hey, look, I can do tricks. And while I gratefully respect the teachings of Paramhansa Yogananda, his teacher, I think that, again, like all of us, we have choices that we can make. And I think that ultimately J. Donald Waters had made choices that really were to benefit himself. And from 1990 forward, there was a number of experiences and press that seemed to prove that he was more about taking care of himself rather than helping others. And I believe, again, that's the challenge that impacts everyone who starts to um, have knowledge or a message. You're always tested, and it's very important to be grounded in the knowledge and the reality that it's not you, it's Creator through you that does the work. And if you're blessed with a gift, whether it's healing or second sight or clairaudience or clairsentience, clairvoyance, use that wisely. Um, there was a time in my life back in the 90s when I was doing healing work that I started to dabble in the idea of doing readings for people. And I very quickly got the message, don't do that, because it changes you, and it's not for the better. And then it becomes something that becomes transactional and monetarily based. And my belief is that if messages come when you're working with someone about healing, then that's fine to share that at that time. But also, as it's said in the Bhagavad Gita, that man can transcend all karma in the blinking of an eye, that just like with healing, just like with energy, your energy can change moment by moment by moment, situation by situation by situation. And that is the truth.
Yeah. Tom, I feel like we can talk for another 2 hours, but I want to be conscious of your time. We are approaching, the end of this
Yeah.
amazing discussion. Any final words?
My words again come down to my thoughts, my opinion, which is show gratitude every day. Be grateful for what you have. When you demonstrate gratitude, it immediately changes your attitude. So if you're feeling angry, if you're feeling upset, but you can stop yourself and have something to be thankful for in this day, in this present moment, you start to realize all that you have. And as you start to realize all that you have, you realize you keep having much, much more that's coming to you. And then to me, that's a time to segue into prayer and meditation. And, by prayer, getting back to that point of realization, it's not about asking God for something. It's about recognizing what God does for you and for others out of love. And then the meditation is that consciousness and that bridge that goes across the chasm of consciousness, where then you're having commune, and sharing the sense of oneness and divinity with Creator and the heavenly host. And I believe that the more that you do that, the faster that you transform and become different. And I believe that that also will be the ultimate key to the healing of our humanity and our transformation in consciousness as human beings.
Tom, thank you very much for everything you are doing for humanity, for us in general, and for listening to the right source. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Claudio. It was a pleasure being on your podcast. Thank you again, brother.
Thank you. And to my viewers, thank you for watching. Leave a comment, visit the links I mentioned at the beginning of the interview. And until next time, love and gratitude.